Library, and thank to the library for sponsoring or putting this program on. And I'm John Lorentz, Professor Emeritus of History at Shawnee State University. And after my academic career of 38 and a half years ended, I took on a whole new career despite myself as a documentary filmmaker along with our son. This is my wife, Gorees, in the front here, and our Jenny, former student of mine years ago at Shawnee State. she did get an A. She was a very good student. Those are the ones you remember, is the good students. In any event, our son and myself sort of quite accidentally got into film work. I'll give you a sort of a brief background of that. I think most of you here probably know of our earlier work, which started out some 17 years ago this October, if you can believe that, with the premiere of River Voices, which is the story of the 1937 flood in Portsmouth, Ohio. And at the time, that was to be a sort of a one-shot affair. Our son lives in Washington, D.C. He has a day job there. I was working full-time at Shawnee State, both teaching and administering, and also at the time I happened to be working on a book. And then now suddenly this came up. It came up because I, having now grown up in Portsmouth and but left for college and never intended to come back. She's got my two books back there, actually. I guess they're here in the library. Those books have nothing to do with local history. They're actually on Middle Eastern history, which is what my actual academic specialty is. In any event, I came back to Portsmouth, having been gone for about almost 35 years, and gallivanted all over the world. I was one of the original Peace Corps volunteers. And as soon as Kennedy started the Peace Corps, I volunteered immediately and went right from Miami University. I graduated one day, and a week later I was in training, and 3 months later I was in Iran for 2 years. Thus these books, which are on Iran, which is my particular academic focus and specialty. And came back, though, after 6 years on the East Coast, 20 years on the West Coast, and came back to being on the ground floor of helping build a brand new university. In this particular case, I was actually hired to create an international dimension to this new university, and as such I wrote the strategic plan and then the operational plan, and became the founding director of the Center for International Programs and Activities at Shawnee State, which some of you may well be familiar with. It's still very much a going concern. So, film was not in my professional or academic life at all. But having come back to Portsmouth and having grown up listening to the stories of my mother and father, who lived just a few blocks from here on 4th Street in a cottage in 1937, and at the height of the flood there was nothing but the chimney sticking out of the cottage, or out of the floodwaters. And my father was got the family out quickly and moved up on the hill with a gentleman that some of you might remember, Joe Kegley, and his family, and left my mother and sister there. And Joe Kegley happened to have a John boat. And so after depositing my mother and sister there, my father and Joe went down and started rescuing people, because the waters came up so fast, and most people stayed in their homes because they said, as someone in the film itself says, well, we'll do just like we did in the 1913 flood. We'll just move our furniture up to the second floor, and then the water recedes. We'll clean it out and move the furniture down and carry on. Well, it was Dr. Bruner, some of you might remember, a dentist here in town who lived on 3rd Street, and he in the film says one of my favorite lines, which was, well, it didn't turn out that way. Because the water just kept on coming, and so people had to be rescued. Over 10,000 people had to be rescued out of their second stories and rooftops. And and so my father and Joe Kegley were involved in those rescue efforts. So I grew up listening to these stories of my parents and their contemporaries. And when I came back to Portsmouth, the floodwall mural project was just beginning a few years after I came back. And I remember, because that floodwall is, of course, the result of the 1937 flood. And I remember asking, people, well, has anybody done anything on the 37 flood? And the answer was a little bit here and a little bit there, but no, nothing comprehensive. The end result was that years went by. In fact, a whole decade went by. And the contemporaries of my mother and father were beginning to die off. They'd reached that age. So it's I kept asking that question over and over again to local historians or people that might have some interest in gathering these people's stories before they were all gone. And this went on, and no one stepped to the plate. I finally got to the point, I said, well, maybe I'll start a little historical preservation project. And that's really all I intended to do, which was to interview a few people. In fact, it was right in this location, in the library, where I interviewed the first couple of people. And it was to just be oral interviews, capture their stories, get them down, and then donate them to the library so that someone later could come along and at least they'd have these stories. And it just by accident happened that our son graduated after I'd just done several interviews. And we went to his graduation ceremony. He had done a master's degree in film and video production. And at the reception for him that day, I happened to say to him that, well, I've started this little, audio project of collecting stories, but it's kind of conducive to film. Would you be interested in maybe joining me to sort of just get these on film? The idea then, again, to pass them on to the library and someone else can use them later. Well, much to my surprise, he said, why not? And because I fully expected him to say, get serious. And of course, there were all these logistical problems as well of him being in Washington, D.C. and us here. But he threw the ball back in my court, and that began the Odyssey. And the Odyssey is still going on because what was supposed to be I ended up getting actually a grant from the Ohio Humanities Council to start this project, and that was pretty minimal. It was $1,000. So it's and I had to bring him from Washington, and we had equipment, we had all sorts of stuff and I remember the Ohio Humanities Council. This is one of my most vivid memories of our film work, telling me that your chances of turning this into a production grant, which is of course considerably more, are 1%. So don't count on it. That we almost never fund production grants, and they just not had much luck with film projects. And then it was what they told me, and says just don't count on it. Well, I took that as a challenge, and I told my son, we can talk about film all you want, but it's what you see visually that counts. So I said, I'm going to put my own money into this, and whatever it takes, we're going to produce a demo piece for them that will knock their socks off. And that's exactly what we did. It sold itself, and we ended up getting a production grant, and the rest is history. This premiered in October 2002. And it's still a standing joke between son and myself, where we used to say, as this was building towards its premiere, that, well, he would ask me, do you think there'll be any continuing interest in this? And I said, well, you know, there'll be a lot of interest, we know, sort of right now for the premiere, and then it'll carry on for a little while, and then, you know, in a couple of months, things will die down, and we'll, you know, get our lives back. Well, that's our standing joke now, because here it is 17 years later and we haven't gotten our lives back. Because this film simply took off. The way I liken it, it was like throwing a rock in a still pond, where it started out here locally with an outstanding premiere. Some of you were, I think, probably at that premiere, and you might recall that it was packed, full house at the Performing Arts Center at Shawnee State. And in fact, we had to turn away, and we knew the number exactly, because it was a ticketed event. The tickets were free, and you could come in and pick them up. And we'd put a coupon in the paper that I said, you know, you can send this coupon in and get 4 tickets per family, or come into the McKinley box office and pick them up. 10 days before the premiere, every ticket was gone. And people kept sending in coupons, kept coming in, and so we kept a list. We had to tell these people, I'm sorry, there's no room. It says tickets are gone. But we kept a list, and we ended up having 267 people beyond the capacity, which is almost 1,200 people, at the Vern Rife Center. I mean, it was just absolutely an unbelievable experience. You know, we never dreamed that that could be possible. In any event, that was, as it turned out, just the beginning, because it just took off from there. It went regional first, and then statewide, and WSU TV in Columbus, PBS station, premiered it on television. They had such a response to it that actually we signed a contract with them that gave them a certain number of times and a period of time for viewing or for airing rights. And they aired it again and again and again in that time period. They had tremendous sales. We ended up, I don't know if you know how this works, but you've certainly seen these PBS programs, and at the end it says, if you want a copy of this, call this 1-800 numbers. Well, that 800 number is WSU, and as a part of the contract we signed with them, we had to give them boxes of videos. And then they took care of the fulfillment, which was, of course, great for us, because then we didn't, I mean, they just took care of sending it out and collecting it and whatnot. And they took, and that's just standard, they took a horrendous cut. So we ended up being sort of supportive of WSU over the years, because each time this has appeared, and then eventually it went national on PBS. WSU wanted to sponsor it to see if it could go national. And as you are aware, I think probably of PBS programs that you'll see sometimes, like it's mainly Boston and Washington, sometimes Oregon, Utah, like Rick Steves, for instance. I'm sure most of you know that program on PBS. That's actually produced by Oregon Public Television, but it goes national. So, and it's the same thing. Each one of those that has something, when you buy something through PBS, then they take a cut from that and take care of the fulfillment. Well, this just kind of went on and on. the time ran out for what we had signed with them, and they wanted to up it, and so we did. And this has gone on and on. It's gone on for 17 years. It's still very much out there. The interest never disappeared. Now, it did dip, decline, but it sort of would level off. There was always some interest in this. And we had a website, and then I kept getting contacted with people from websites. It ended up being entered into various film festivals, first in the United States and then in Europe. So this has actually gone worldwide. And the interest just simply never died down. One sort of side note that you might find of interest is that every time that there is a major flood, there's an upsurge of interest in river voices. And people go through floods, and they're looking in the internet, and they end up finding river voices, and suddenly there's a big upsurge in sales. The biggest one of all, by far, was Katrina. Where the horrendous for many months upsurge of interest in this nationwide. And on it's gone, and every year after year I keep saying, well, this has got to sort of wind its way down sooner or later, but it doesn't. Now the question is why? And that's actually what I want to get to today in terms of talking about our current film work on Dreamland, the Dreamland project, which is on Dreamland Pool here in Portsmouth. Because there's a continuous thread here that connects our film work together. And that's why I'm sorry to take so much time, but that's why I'm taking the time to sort of introduce you into that thread. Because there's sort of continuity here, beginning with River Voices and then carrying on to our second film, which was on the flood wall murals, called Beyond These Walls. And that film is really about the subtitle, which is Building Community Through Public Art. And what we discovered from that film, because I can shortcut talking about that film, because everything that I just described with River Voices, the exact same thing happened with Beyond These Walls. It ended up premiering on WSU. They ended up sponsoring to go national on PBS. It ended up in film festivals. It ended up, in fact, it's appearing in a film festival next month. In Louisville. And the same sort of pattern sort of has emerged now. This is a story, Beyond These Walls is a story of the flood wall murals in Portsmouth, Ohio. So why is there this interest that doesn't die out? Well, because there's a universal theme here. As I say, when people ask me all the time, what's this flood wall mural film? What's this film about? Pretty pictures, good art. What? Well, yeah, it's that. But no, that's not what it's about. It's about building community through public art. And what we discovered, especially when this thing, that's when it really came home, was that when this went national on PBS, I started getting calls from all over the country. I got calls from Alaska, from California, from Oregon, from Washington, Louisiana, Connecticut, Michigan, New York, on and on it went. And interestingly enough, and again, just a little side note here about how PBS works, is that what they do when they take a program that's going to go national is that they rent satellites space and time. It's very, very expensive to do so, but that's it's what they're set up to do. So they then send out to every PBS station in the country the coordinates of the satellite, because all these stations now have satellite dishes. So, and then they download the program, and then we, for instance, signed a contract with them saying again that they had a certain period of time for airing rights, and a certain number of times. So stations download this, and then they just fit it in terms of their local programming, whatever that might be, and they had 6 months' time to do so. So for the next 6 months, WOSU aired it immediately, right off of satellite. And then they downloaded it to do the same thing. Perhaps a side note there you might find of interest, because if you have seen it on TV, you haven't seen this. Because this film is 68 minutes long. And when they decided they wanted to air this, they said, well, we'd love to air this, but you have to edit it down to 57 minutes, because the way PBS works, an hour-long program cannot be 1 second longer than 57 minutes. It can be shorter because they can put something in the shorts to fill in the space, but they must have every hour 3 minutes to have their programming, upcoming programming, and thank sponsors and all that. And that's an ironclad rule. So they said 57 minutes. Well, this created a dilemma, because when you edit a film, I mean, you have so much to edit this down, and it's a complete work in a sense when it comes out. It came out in this DVD, and now we had to take this if we wanted it aired on PBS and edit out 11 minutes. Well, that proved to be a very, very difficult task, and tried to still remain sort of consistent and to show that where it wasn't evident. It was particularly difficult because we had original music composed for this by a Los Angeles film music composer, and that music we could not take out. I mean, it would be very evident wherever that music was. So essentially, that had 27 minutes of original music. So that meant we really had to cut out 11 minutes out of about 40 minutes or so, and that's 25%. So it was extremely difficult. In any event, we did it, and it went national. So there it was kind of a story about Beyond These Walls. But back to my point, which is that how do you sort of account that the story of Portsmouth, Ohio in 1937 and the floodball murals of Portsmouth, Ohio had such intense interest nationwide? The reason is this sort of connective thread that I'm talking about, which is carrying on into the current project, the Dreamland project. That thread would be a sense of community, and the significance or the importance of a sense of community for what happens in that community and for development in that community of any sort, in nature. And we didn't start out quite that way. With River Voices, we started out basically just wanting to tell the story of Portsmouth, Ohio in 1937. But what emerged from this was really a story of, a universal story of hope, and how communities and individuals cope with natural disaster. And what happened in 1937 was that the community, instead of looking for an outside savior, looking to the federal government or insurance companies or FEMA or someone outside the community to come in and save the community, rebuild the community. What people did was they just rolled their sleeves up, locked hands with their neighbors and friends, and got to work and rebuilt the community. Or as someone says in the film, we not only survived, but we thrived. Well, there's a lesson there that people can connect with today. And again, the contrast would be Katrina. What happened in Katrina? I mean, it was a huge natural disaster, but it was made 10 times worse by people not working together. There was no sense of community at that time. It was every person for themselves and looking for some outside savior to come in, and thus it was multiplied as a disaster many times over. That didn't happen in 37, and people identified with this idea of, oh, yes, that's when we begin to see that, oh, okay, even though we had not sort of intentionally done that to begin with, that yes, there is this story there that is universal in nature, and it's that universality which is the reason it hasn't died. That interest has never been lost in it because it's an eternal story. Same thing with Beyond These Walls, where the universal here is this, again, idea of building community through public art. Every community, in one way or another, is trying to revitalize itself. And what's happening as a nationwide trend is that more and more people are beginning to understand that you can't rely upon some foreign country or big business to come in and build a big factory and give you jobs, and then everything's going to be fine and dandy because of jobs. Now, it doesn't work that way anymore. It's a different world, and people have to think differently. And what's happening nationwide is more and more communities are understanding this and looking at local assets and what they can do to take local assets and translate that into development in the community. Thus, there's that story. This is the irony, and it never ceases to amaze me because I'm sure this is a common experience of all of us. You hear people trash Portsmouth all the time. And when I hear people now trash Portsmouth, I say, have you seen Beyond These Walls? And invariably the answer is no. And I said, well, go and look at this, and then come back and talk to me, because Portsmouth is actually, and this is true, I mean, we know this as an absolute matter of fact in terms of all the contacts that now I've had nationwide because of this film, because of its appearance on PBS, was that Portsmouth is actually being held up as a role model by other communities around the country, in New York, in Louisiana, in Oregon, in California. I can give you, specific stories of how these communities have gotten hold of this film, used this film to stimulate sort of ideas of how they can take whatever local assets they might have and translate those into development and ultimately economic development in their community. And even abroad, I sent one of these off a couple of months ago to New Zealand. Again, we have a website, so it's out there, and people are looking and searching, and found this community in New Zealand found this film and wanted a copy. Got in touch with me, and we communicated about this. They wanted to use this as kind of a role model for what they perhaps could do in their small New Zealand community. That's pretty exciting stuff, actually. This is now what we have tried to, or are trying to translate into what we're doing on Dreamland. Because, and this should look familiar to most of you, these kinds of pictures of the good times at Dreamland Pool. One of the, and I want to give you a little bit of background or history to how we came to this. When these first two films came out, and each one of them, I had people in the community that kept saying, "Why don't you do something on Dreamland Pool?" And I resisted for years and years and years because I didn't see how I could tell the story of Dreamland Pool without it being a personal story, because my father, who is in this picture up here, Chuck Lorentz, some of you might remember him. I was a high school teacher across the street here at Portsmouth High School, a coach, and also the co-manager of Dreamland Pool for 30-some years, along with Pat Mitchell, who was the principal at Garfield School. Some of you might remember him from, you're a graduate of Garfield, okay. So those two worked together very, very closely, and in my growing up, I pretty much grew up in that pool. I learned to swim before I learned to walk. And as soon as I was 8 years old or something, I was picking up papers out in the yard, and I sort of worked my way up and to various positions in Dreamland. Eventually, by the time I was in high school, I was a lifeguard. So I spent 4 years in a lifeguard chair in high school, and that was great stuff. Big men on campus stuff, because that's where all your contemporaries and all your friends were all summer long. So those were glory years, and I was too close to this, and I just didn't see how there was It was wonderful times. It was what you see here, but I didn't see a universal story, and so I resisted and resisted, and eventually it began to dawn on me that, well, there may be something here, because years, probably 15 or 20 years ago, someone started a social media thread on Dreamland Pool. And it actually appeared first on classmates.com, where this very picture was where is that picture? Yeah, you can grab that picture back there. Now so it's this picture here, the same one. Yeah, it's of Dreamland. Yes, this was actually originally a placemat at a high school reunion, PHS, Portsmouth High School class reunion, in which they had the theme of their reunion, Dreamland Pool. And this was the placemat at their banquet. And this became so popular as it kept being reproduced over and over again, people wanted a copy of this. That about the second or third time this was reprinted, they'd asked if they could put on the back of this the story of Dreamland. Now, the story there is that I'm at the turn of the millennium, December 31st, I guess it was, 1999. The newspaper published an issue which was a retrospective of Portsmouth in the 20th century. And so all these different elements of the community had people had written up and had pictures and whatnot, and they asked me if I, because of my father and my connection to the pool, if I would write an article on Dreamland Pool. Well, I did. So this appeared in into 1999, and I called it a fond remembrance. And one of the phenomena that has occurred is that over and over and over again, people asked me for copies of this article, even to the point that eventually it got printed on the back of this placemat. Still, there's demand for this. So, it was very clear that there was an awful lot of interest out there, but I still sort of resisted. But this very picture appeared on this social media thread. And I picked it up and started following this, and figured, like most social media threads, it would die out, and because there's a lot of interest to begin with, and then gradually people don't post anymore, and it sort of dies out, which happens to most threads. And I began noticing that, gee, this is not dying out. It's just going on and on and on. And I followed it for years. This went on for years. And I even posted myself on it because my father's name came up a number of times in various posts. And I responded. It was a real curiosity to me is wow, there's like a lot of interest in this, and Dreamland pools have been destroyed and gone since 1993. What accounts for that? And what I did was I sat down and I printed out this long list of several years of these comments on social media. And I started trying to identify what's the commonality here. And what I discovered was that from the time the pool opened, which was in 1929, until its demise in 1993, so you had 6 generations here, over 60 years of existence, and that you could pretty much tell what generation people that posted on this media thread was, which decade were they. So I actually sort of analyzed these, and what I noticed is that people are saying the same things every decade. It's like it was timeless. It's like people in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s they were all saying the same things, and then you had people that posted, and then it was their child or grandchild. Generations would post on this as well, all saying the same thing. That's when I became convinced that there's something here which is beyond just nostalgia. Now, nostalgia is certainly a part of this, but I became convinced that there's something deeper here than just sort of nostalgia, and wanted to sort of explore that. Well, that started years, and this was it was sort of an idea that formed, and then it took some years to really bring it to the point where now we could talk about doing a film on it. So I did a lot of research. I'm a historian, and that's my thing in any event. So I decided to start looking at other communities and other swimming pools, and swimming pools in general. And I ended up talking to sociologists in particular, and trying to sort of figure out, okay, is there any literature out there on pools? Turned out there is. I talked to sociologists about, well, is there a kind of little OSU background here, huh? Go Bucks. So it turned out, yes, there was a body of literature out there, and some even theoretical literature. So I've devoured this, and then figure out that, all right, there is some universal theme here, because some community pools, for instance, are successful, others aren't. So why? And so I began exploring that. And eventually what I came back to was exactly what we had been doing, or we did with Beyond These Walls. That's where this common thread is. Because what we did with Beyond These Walls was take a particular instance, in this case, the flood wall murals in Portsmouth, Ohio, and tried to figure out, okay, what is it that makes these things so popular? Why do people keep coming? And many of you remember that when the idea first came up of painting murals on the flood wall, 99% of the people in Portsmouth said, "What? Are you crazy? You're throwing paint up on concrete, it'll be trashed in no time at all." And look what it's become. As you may or may not know, it's now the #1 tourist attraction in the state of Ohio. And for all the skeptics that were out there to begin with, go out in the streets and ask 100 people randomly, if someone comes to town, where do you take them? I guarantee you 100 out of 100 will say the flood wall murals. So this has become so important in terms of the community and the revitalization of this community, and that's what we wanted to get to, and thus the title, which is not accidental, Beyond These Walls. That art takes you someplace beyond these walls, which were described by the artist himself when he came to town to paint the first mural as a concrete prison wall. And someone else in the film says concrete monstrosity, and now it's a thing of beauty and become a focus of attraction, bringing people in. So that's what we wanted to follow, and thus that title, Building Community Through Public Art. So after doing this research relating to swimming pools, I decided well, maybe we can do the same thing, but do it with pool, in this case, Dreamland pool, as sort of representative, again, of something special that went on in this community for, in this case, over 6 decades. And so there again is that theme of a sense of community. And as I began looking deeper into it, I became quite convinced that, yes, there's what we need to do. So our particular focus is, in this case, not art, but public spaces. Public spaces and the role that public spaces play in the lives of communities. And in this particular case, just like we took the Portsmouth floodwall murals as an instance to illustrate this larger theme, we're doing the same thing with Dreamland Pool. And setting it within this context of the idea of the significance and important role that public spaces play in the lives of communities, but using Dreamland Pool as the focus of it. Now, as a part of that, you get into the history of the pool and every aspect of it, which is, again, a sort of part of what we are working on right now. We've been at this for some time. It is one of the things that has slowed us down considerably is finding sufficient, believe it or not. I did not think this was going to be a problem, but it has been a problem for us. Finding sufficient visual material. What we discovered when we started interviewing people, talking to people, and looking, working on this seriously, was that everybody, it seems, in town of a certain age at least, has this wonderful memories of Dreamland Pool. They have these terrific stories of things that went on at Dreamland and what this, how important that was to them in growing up. So we have a tremendous amount of interview footage and material, but we have not been able to match that up fully yet with enough visual material. People simply didn't take pictures back in those days, or didn't take cameras at least. Of course, these were in the days when it wasn't digital, so you had to have film in the camera and whatnot, and I guess people just didn't think of taking cameras to pools. So there was, we've had a significant problem of finding enough material, especially in certain aspects, because the pictures that people did take very often were very much of the same thing. So we'll have a lot of pictures relating to one activity at the Dreamland Pool, and then none for others. For instance, one of the things that was actually a surprise to me, it was everybody that we have interviewed, everybody we've talked to talks about the midnight swim dances, the Friday night swim dances at the pool. Everybody's got these wonderful stories and about those Friday night swim dances, because that's where, for generations, that's where youth were. And of course, if they weren't out cruising and drinking beer and getting in trouble, they were up at this pool, swimming, dancing, playing basketball. That was, and it wasn't just dancing to a jukebox. For many decades, at least 2 or 3 times a summer, there would be a live band that would be there on Friday night. So we have all these stories, and we have not been able to locate one single photo of kids dancing up at Dreamland Pool. I mean, that's just been a shock to me. I just do it, but that's the reality right now. And there are some other activities. For instance, for about 3 decades, there was a swim team at Dreamland Pool, and a lot of great stories about these swim meets and the swim teams and all these sort of activities. But we've been able to find very, very few photos or films. What is gold to us, and I'm making an appeal to you as an audience, in case you happen to know anybody that might possibly, or you yourself might possibly have something. What would be gold to us would be the old 8mm films. Or VHS or whatever format, depending upon the decade. We would love to get our hands on more of that. We have found some, but we need more, and we're looking for more. So in any event, that's kind of a quick status report of where we are in the project. We're well along in the project right now. I would say that we're probably 60% or more. We've got the storyline. We've got sort of the chapters, so to speak. We've done quite a bit of editing. There's a lot of pieces to fill in. And there's been some sort of variation, well, that's just the nature of the beast. Is that when you start out on writing a book or doing a film or any sort of major project of this sort, is that you have an idea of how you want to proceed, but as you work on it, you begin to see that some avenues are dead ends, and others you've never dreamed of, and the path opens up, or it's something you need to deal with. A good example of that might be with the issue of integration at Dreamland. Now, we knew that had to be kind of part of the story, that the fact that it was a segregated pool because it was a private pool. Until the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So we knew that had to be a part of the story, but it's turned out that this is a much deeper and much more interesting story than I ever imagined it to begin with, and we're getting into that quite significantly. Partially because of an interview that we had with a gentleman who was probably familiar to some of you. Probably the greatest athlete that Portsmouth ever produced. His name was Gentry. He was one of the 4 young African Americans who jumped the gates and jumped into the Dreamland pool, which led directly to its integration in the 1964. Kurt's now in his 80s, well into his 80s, 85, 86 maybe. His eyesight is failing. And he couldn't, travel, but he lives in Greensboro, North Carolina. So we actually went down to Greensboro. My son came down from D.C. and I went down from here, and we spent a full half day with him, and that turned into be a very, very powerful, interview. And I can elaborate on that if anyone wishes, but time's moving on, and I want to, get some other points in here before time runs out. In any event, this is definitely sort of a piece of the story. Also, what turned out to be a pretty significant factor because of the contrast here is the Dreamland was opened, as I mentioned, in 1929. It was not built by local interests. It was built by a man from Canova, West Virginia, who actually had built a Dreamland pool in Canova. That pool, which opened in 1925, or 4 years before the pool here in Portsmouth, is still existent. It's still very much alive. And one of the, and to give you just a very brief sort of background here, is that that same gentleman that built the pool in Canova used pretty much the same contractors and architects and whatnot involved in terms of building the pool here in Portsmouth. As a consequence, they're almost sister pools. Now, if you look at them today, you'll say, oh, well, that doesn't look like what Dreamland looked like. Well, that was because the original wood pavilion of Dreamland Canova burnt down. And they reoriented, where the dressing rooms and whatnot to the end instead of on the side. And so, but other than that, in terms of the pool, except that the piers, remember Dreamland Portsmouth had two piers, and with light stanchions on them. Well, so did Canova Dreamland, but these piers, which were in the shape you see here, are round in the Canova pool. But the same idea, it's just a round pier, 2 piers with lights. So we had to sort of follow that story. What happened here, and why does that pool still existent and ours in Portsmouth is not? Well, it's a complicated story, but the bottom line is, and let me fill in one other bit here, is that that pool here in Portsmouth was originally, when it was built and opened in 1929, called Dreamland Pool. But it was bought out in the mid-1930s by Portsmouth interests, and it was then renamed Terrace Club. So for most of its existence, it wasn't called Dreamland. From the mid-1930s up until 1965, when the change became official. After the integration of the pool, the charter was redone, and they renamed the pool from its Terrace Club, which was what it was for 30 years, to back to what its original name was, which was Dreamland Pool. And then it was Dreamland from mid-1960s until its demise in the early 1990s. So about half and half, Dreamland and Terrace Club. So it went from Dreamland to Terrace Club to Dreamland again. The pool in Canova has always been, since 1925, Dreamland Pool. So one of the things that we needed to track down, and we ended up spending 3 days filming in Canova. I went up there twice, actually, and spent some time up there. Talking to and trying to find out what is it? What's the story of Dreamland Canova, and why did that continue on? And it's really almost a tragic story in some ways, because what happened in Canova was that they went through exactly the same issues and problems that faced Dreamland Pool here in Portsmouth, but the difference is that this was privately owned, and back in the 1940s, the city of Canova took over. It was privately owned from 1925 up until the late 40s, and then it was bought by the city and turned into a city park. So it was public ownership then at that point. But that pool ran into exactly the same problems that you had here in Portsmouth as far as the pool was concerned. Cost issues, insurance, the maintenance just became out of sight. Because this is an enormous pool, as was Canova. This was the size of a football field, 100 yards long, 40 yards wide, 1,000,000 gallons. Of water. So there was, there was a lot of expense in terms of keeping up, and then of course, as that went up, there were other factors involved. And again, Canova faced the same thing, which is that when most of us of an older generation grew up, there weren't backyard pools. Swim in a higher river, this side of the river, or Dreamland Pool. That was it. People started building pools, and then other communities built pools. So you ended up having community pools in Medford and New Boston, and Clay Township built a pool. So there's a number of these other sort of community pools that came into existence, all of which sort of drained the clientele for Dreamland here in Portsmouth. Another factor was delayed maintenance as it began running into cost factors. Is that where there was some declining attendance, then delayed maintenance, and then that became kind of a vicious spiral. But they ran into exactly the same thing Canova. Exactly every one of these issues was faced by Canova. But their pool is still existing. Why? And that becomes instructive in terms of the point that we're getting at in the theme that I was talking about earlier as far as this film is concerned. What happened there was that there was some visionary leadership at the city level that basically, where there was this sort of demand, and in terms of the city council of Canova, there was this sort of demand that they cannot maintain this burden anymore of this pool. It was draining resources. But there was a mayor there, a very interesting gentleman, who we've spent a lot of time talking with. And some of you might even know, if you ever go up to Canova, there's Griffith's Drug Store, which dates back to the mid-19th century. and still in existence, and it has a tin roof, and it has a soda fountain with the marble. You still get an old-time fashioned soda up there. If you ever go to downtown Canova, go into Griffith's drugstore and have a soda. That'll bring back some memories. But the owner of that drugstore, it's been in the same family for 100 and some years, was Rick Griffith was his name, and he was the mayor. And he basically put his foot down, in essence, and he told us this little story, which will undoubtedly be in the film, where the city council had voted, was going to vote on this, and it was clear that this pool was going to be shut down. So the mayor said that if you vote to shut down this pool, as mayor, I'm going to have a plaque made up on the site of where Dreamland Pool was located, saying, with the names of each city councilman on that, saying this city council had voted to close Dreamland Pool. And that bought him a year, so they agreed to delay it for a year. And that was contingent upon finding funding. Well, what he did was, what didn't happen in Portsmouth, was that he basically then went out to the community and said, look, we have this problem, and if you want to get involved in saving Dreamland Pool, here's the chance. And what happened was there was a rallying of community members that ended up, in the end, saving that pool. And there's some dramatic stories involved in terms of how that actually occurred. And the key moment was when WSAZ-TV actually covered the next year the city council meeting. And what happened in that city council meeting that led to this now becoming a story that was picked up, and that brought this to the attention of Marathon Oil. And Marathon Oil then stepped in and said, well, maybe we can help out here. And the story of what happened was just quite remarkable. Now, Marathon has, remember, they used to have their operations. That was they've since now moved to Cincinnati. They still have the refinery, but the head of their operations were in Ashland, almost across the river, practically, from the pool in Canova. And what they did was, they had contacts with constructions people all over the area, because they spread their business around, and they had these cement companies. They didn't rely upon one cement company when they built something. They got companies from within a 50-mile radius, actually, would come in and be a part of their supply chain for major construction projects. So they had these contacts. So what they did is they went to these cement companies, because the entire pool was deteriorated to such an extent that it needed a good $250,000 to redo the cement, work in the pool. And again, the same size pool, size of a football field. That's a lot of cement. A lot of work. So what they did was they went to their suppliers and said, would you be willing to donate to as part of this project? Got sort of a consortium going in which everyone sort of agreed to supply at cost. All right. So they supplied labor. But each company picked up the labor cost, and the cement itself was just cost. So they did $250,000 work for something in the range of $50,000 to $75,000, and and completely redid the pool, and that's sort of what saved it. The community otherwise got involved as well, and the pool was very much a going concern. Unfortunately, that did not happen here in Portsmouth, and some of you might even recall that time when the city was actually offered. The pool was for sale, and the city was actually offered the pool for what would have been an absolute song, but you refused to consider it. And there was actually a movement here in Portsmouth at the time to try to save the pool, and the argument was that the citizens would not go for this, so the movement at the time said, well, why don't you let the citizens decide? Let's have a referendum. And that did not happen, and actually the details of what actually occurred are not really pleasant to recall, frankly. But in any event, it didn't happen, and we lost the pool. Was it realistic to continue it on? Well, again, Canova pool, and not just Canova pools, but other pools that we've looked at, tell a story. Is it a money loser? Yes. But then parks are money loser. Is that an argument not to have a park? And we took a look at the finances, for instance, of how are they able to continue on? I mean, this is losing money every year. But if you look at the finances, you see that it works out that only about it varies from year to year, but 20 to 30% of this comes out of tax money. In other ways, they've been able to generate income to continue. Well, that's a pretty good investment in a community, if you ask me, because what is really the impact of that pool, and what was it in the case of Dreamland over all those decades? It was this sense of community that developed, and this is probably a story that's familiar to some of you here, but I know when I grew up, that there were community schools all around the city. So you went to school pretty much in the area where you lived, and there were a lot of different schools. But by the time I got to high school, my friends in high school were from all over the city of Portsmouth, not just from, in my case, McKinley School, right? Why? Because I had all these friendships that I developed at Dreamland Pool. Now, what did that mean? And in looking at this at other communities as well, you see the same phenomena at work, where when you went to Dreamland Pool as a young kid, you were all in swimming suits. And in those days, it wasn't designer swimming suits. It was, you pretty much are all dressed the same, your females and males, and in these more or less generic swimsuits from Janssen and whatnot. So you had no idea the people that you were interacting and playing with and growing up with in Dreamland Pool, what their socioeconomic. Everybody was the same, and you develop these through play and good fun and fellowship and dancing and everything, all the activities, the picnicking, the playing football and playing softball and basketball and ping pong and shuffleboard and in the restaurant and on the patios. I mean, there was all this interaction that was taking place in good fun, in which there was a sense that of a community, of an entire community, the community of Portsmouth, not your own little social clique or own socioeconomic class. That had a fundamental impact as we looked in this in terms of pools nationwide. A fundamental impact really on developing that idea of now being in this together. That's again the significance or importance of a sense of community in terms of what happens in that community. So that's really what the focus of this this film is about, and we're trying to get at. And as I say, we're well along in this now, so we're hoping to have, because this is the number one question I ask all the time, is when is this film coming out? At this point, I think a reasonable date would be next spring. So if everything goes well, you never know. That's the earliest. I think probably more realistically, because things come up, would be fall of next year. So we're looking to have another premiere here, hopefully in the Performing Arts Center at the university, about a year from now or so, of the Dreamland project. We haven't given it an exact name yet, but Dreamland will certainly be in the name. So there's some lessons to be learned about what we've discovered in terms of looking at swimming pools and looking at the case of Dreamland Pool here in Portsmouth. That lesson is exactly what I've emphasized over and over again, that this pool played a very important role in terms of the city of Portsmouth, and that sort of sense of community that I think all of us actually miss now as we're buried in our phones and the social media and whatnot. It never ceases to shock me, frankly, to see university students that will be texting one another when they're 10 feet away from one another. It's like and you didn't have that, back in those days, and you certainly didn't have it at Dreamland Pool. There was interaction, and I think that had some profound consequences in terms of the community itself. So I'm going to stop there because I'm sure you will have some questions, and I can go on and on and on. There's a lot of stories, but I believe I'll stop there and open it up for questions.
You say the pool in West Virginia is the exact same size?
It's slightly.
It seems smaller.
It seems smaller because of the layout, and it's because, as I said, the locker rooms and everything went up on one end, and so you kind of get a skewed sort of in terms of the dimensions from the way it's laid out. It's not quite the same size. It's very close, but it is a little smaller. Yes. It was actually, Dreamland Pool was actually the largest private pool east of the Mississippi for most of its history. Now, there were some public pools that were a little larger. For instance, Coney Island Pool in Cincinnati is actually a larger pool, but that was a public pool, not a private pool. So it is true that it was the largest, for almost all of its existence, the largest private pool east of the Mississippi. Yes?
Do they sell Dreamland or passes to the Dreamland Pool in Kenova like a season ticket? Do you have
Yeah.
any idea the cost of those tickets now?
I do not off the top of my head. I think they're pretty reasonably priced, just as Dreamland season tickets. I don't know, some of you might remember what you paid for a season ticket, but it was pretty minimal. I've got all those figures down from year to year to year, and what it cost in 1935, for instance, and what it cost in 1960. So I mean, I have those figures. I just don't have them off the top of my head. But over all those years, there was inflation. But I mean, still, even up until its closure in the 1990s, the season tickets were still a real bargain.
Do you know how much the season tickets were, say in the mid to late 80s to 90s? Do you have any idea? Because we're sitting there talking about what we think we can buy. It seems to me that they were more than.
I paid $16.
Yeah.
$16. What year was that?
That's what I'm
Early
saying.
70s.
Early 70s. That's about right.
My dad wouldn't buy me a season to Dreamland because we belong to the Elks. So you want to go to the pool, you go to the Elks. You want to go to that pool, you buy it yourself.
Buy it yourself. We heard over and over again stories of kids that went out and delivered papers, cut grass, did everything because their parents said, "Well, you have to buy your own season ticket here." Exactly the same kind of story. We've heard 100 such stories, and that season ticket was so cherished. Just cherished. And in fact, we keep running into people that still have their season tickets. So that's one of the reasons I know what they were at various points in time, because we actually have pictures of season tickets spread over quite a period of time.
Did you look into the construction of the McKinley Pool in our community as well?
Yes, that's one of the things that's actually taken a good deal of our attention here, and recently, partially because as an historian, I wanted to make sure that the record was straight on how McKinley Pool came into existence, why, what the timing was, all that. It turned out to be a fairly complex story, and it was complicated by the fact that a Cleveland black newspaper decided to do a story on McKinley Pool. And what they were coming out with, and fortunately, because of of our work, in the story that they wrote, they did talk to some people, but they didn't necessarily talk to the right people to get the story accurate. Fortunately, and it wasn't just me. In fact, it actually went through Drew Fite, who's a fellow historian of mine at Shawnee State University, and he's a local historian, and he's doing some really great work in terms of collecting Portsmouth history. He had been contacted, to sort of verify this story, or to at least have some input before it was published. And he came to me, and I was able to help sort of correct some of the incorrect assumptions and things that were put in to that article. That's now been published, and it basically is, I think, an accurate picture of how McKinley Pool came into existence from the black perspective, let's say. But that's why I said that we didn't expect that this was going to be as much a part of the film as it's becoming, because that's what keeps coming up. That there's sort of beliefs, let's say, out there that don't jive up with the actualities of how, why, the timing of that pool, and so we're trying to come up with to come up with an historically accurate picture of that. But the bottom line is that the sort of fundamental impulse towards the building of that pool is that moved it forward. And that's where there is some misunderstanding, is that it was not because of the drowning of a young black boy. That pool was already it was in the works. But that certainly was the event that propelled it forward, where a young black boy by the name of McKinley was drowned in the Sauter River. It was the last day they'd just gotten out of school. So it was last day of school, and this young McKinley boy and some of his friends went swimming down where the gravel, pits were in the Sauter River, which was a fairly common occurrence. The problem was that they couldn't swim. I mean, so basically they waded. But McKinley had stepped off of in one of these pits and a ledge and ended up drowning, and that then propelled what then later became McKinley Pool. And McKinley Pool, of course, now Portsmouth City pool. Well, they have struggled year after year after year. There's been all sorts of issues in keeping that pool going. But I'm actually happy to say, and I have a feeling our film is going to contribute to what I now see as a positive trend, that there's going to be much more attention, and is this year, is much more attention paid to that pool as far as the city fathers are concerned. I see actually a future for that pool, whereas if you'd asked me that same question 3 years ago, I'd say that pool is pretty much gone. But there's that's a story in its own right. I think an important story that so McKinley Pool is on the upswing. Yes.
Anything in particular with the portion of the pool that was the picnic area? Was that an add-on kind of thing?
Well, that's a very good question. One of the reasons that pool thrived for so many decades is that the gentleman that ended up owning the pool for a good part of its existence before the 1960s was Jamie Williams. Now, that name might be familiar to some of you because he was part owner, at least, and a major owner of Williams Shoe Manufacturing, which, of course, that building is just a few blocks away here. And he was also the city auditor of Portsmouth for decades. And he was independently wealthy, so he certainly didn't need any income from the pool, and he conceived of that pool as basically being important for the city. So the pool made money. It did very well because it's, that was the place. So even though they didn't charge much, just they made up in volume for whatever the minimal charge was. So they made money all right. But Jamie Williams never took a dime out of that pool. Every year he took whatever profits in the pool and he put it back in. And a part of that was buying more and more land. And you might recall that by the time, ironically, this ended up being a detriment ultimately because it covered so much land that the land became more valuable than what was on it from a business perspective. But over decades, they kept buying more and more property until by the 1990s, you had Dreamland, which extended all the way from pretty much where the viaduct is there that goes over the railroad tracks, all the way down to the corner of Kendall Avenue, up Kendall Avenue, and of course that included what was built and actually helped keep the pool alive for as long as it was the tennis club. That was built on pool property. That was pool property, and the original owners were the owner of the pool and another gentleman that went jointly together. And unfortunately, their sort of breaking apart was one of the things that really damaged the bottom line, so to speak, of the pool. But for a long period of time, that was an important part of the income of the pool. So, and they kept buying land. Well, one of those pieces of property they bought was where is our entree into the film that we're doing itself. And that is sort of a personal story. And this is another reason why I was astounded at this continuing interest in Dreamland Pool. It so happened that in 1950, I remember it well because I was with my father at the time when he closed the pool up in the evening, and I was with him when he went to the corner of Gallia and the sort of the south side of Gallia there, pretty much where Captain D's used to be located. In 1950, there was this Ohio gas station there. Now, it's Ohio Southern Oil of Ohio, and then, red, white, and blue, and stripes, like a flag stripe on it. Big oval sign that station had been there for, I don't know how long, but probably well before I was born. But they were tearing that gas station down. And I remember my father going to the gas station, and the construction workers were actually tearing down the building, and there was that sign sticking up there. And my father went and said to these workers that, well, what are you going to do with that, this sign? And they said, oh, well, just go into the trash like everything is to be recycled, melted down or whatever. And because it was solid steel, that thing is heavy and thick. It was like a tank plate. And my father said, well, I'd like to buy that sign from you if you're just, going to trash it. So they said, and these were, young, workers, relatively young, most of which spent time in the pool. And my father said, well, the owner has bought this property on Kendall Avenue. It's now apartment buildings, and it's sort of raised up off of Kendall Avenue, where they put fill dirt in there when they built those apartments. Pretty much across and a little bit up from where the motel is. And what was a consistently serious problem in the 1940s, and I do remember, those who see, you'd go to the pool and cars would be parked up Kendall Avenue all the way up to the top and even over across the street into the housing project over there. It would just be packed, and because there was no place to park except for, on Kendall Avenue. So the owners, Jamie Williams, bought that property, and it was flat at that time. It was just before Kendall Avenue starts to go up, and there was this pretty large, flat area in there. He bought that property, and then, but nobody knew that it belonged to the pool. So my dad said, well, we need to put a sign up there. And then he got this brainstorm and, went over there. And so he told these workers that's what he wanted it for. He wanted to take the sign, repaint it, with a parking pool on it, and hang it up there in Kendall Avenue. And these workers said, well, oh yeah, we'll just give it to you. And they literally, I was present, so I literally watched this. They got ladders and they got up and did their thing, and they literally took that sign down right there and helped Dad put it in the trunk of our car, and we had to tie the trunk down because it was too big for the trunk. So we took that home, and I remember sitting on our basements because I helped them get it in the house and our basement. And I remember sitting on the steps. I was 10 years old, and watching my father paint that sign. And on one side it said Terrace Club Parking. On the other side it said in bigger letters, Parking Pool. And it was painted in the colors that all who've been to Dreamland will remember, the blue and the yellow. Because the ladders and all the paint trim of everything in the pool was all in that exact same collar pattern. And so Dad put a metal pipe, sunk it in about 3 feet of concrete right there on Kendall Avenue. And there was that sign hanging from 1950 until 1993. So when they were destroying the pool, after it had been bought by another private owner, and with all these grandiose plans to build a convention center and a hotel, and a lot of pie in the sky that, of course, never happened. It ended up being, as you well know, a strip mall. It's Aldi's, Deep End is an Aldi's parking lot. So that sign was still there, and since I'd remembered this story, when they were tearing the pool down, I went down and followed exactly the same pattern. I said, what are you going to do with that sign? Well, this is going to go into, recycling or on. And I said, I told them the story about my father. I said, I'd like to have that sign. I'll pay you for it. Can I buy it from you? Well, they heard that story, and exactly the same thing happened. They said, oh no, we'll just give it to you. So I said, fine, but do me a favor. I don't want to take it now. I knew at that time that my mother and father had my father had retired and they'd moved to Florida. But I knew that my mother and father were coming up from Florida in about 6 months' time. And so I wanted him to take that sign down. So everything was completely flattened up there. All that area where the strip mall is and everything, it's just completely, flattened. But you come down Kendall Avenue, and there was that sign sticking up there for 6 months as a sentinel, so to speak. Well, Mom and Dad came to town. We had a little reception for them up at Hillview. With friends and whatnot. So it was like a Sunday, noon. A reception and luncheon. And about 2 o'clock or so, I told Dad that I said, I'd like to take you down to Dreamland Pool. Well, Dreamland Pool didn't exist, and my father knew that, of course. And he said, no, I just can't. It just, it'll break my heart. I mean, I just can't, I don't want to. And he kept resisting as I kept saying, well, I want you to come with me. And so finally, I just put my foot down and I said, Dad, there's a reason. Trust me. Just please come with me. So we did get in the car, and it was like driving someone to a funeral. I mean, I've never seen my father so morose and sad in all his life, quiet, and you could just see the pain on his face. And we get to the top of Kendall Avenue, and we're coming down Kendall Avenue, and I had made an arrangement for a welder to meet us in a pickup truck because that was sunk in this concrete. You couldn't dig it out really. So it's to cut this this off. There was this that set a time for this guy to meet us there, and there he was, waiting by that sign, and my dad spotted that sign, and I'll never forget its face. It was just lit up like a Christmas tree, and we got there, and I said, Dad, I remember you put this sign up, and I said, and you're going to take it down. So I said, I'm going to my office at school. Here you are with the, well, you take care of it. I'll see you at home when later in the day. And I get home, and there's that sign in our driveway. But the sign was in really bad shape. People had taken, 22 shots at it. So it had, some pock marks and this and that. But and the paint was it'd been up there for 50 years almost, 40-some years. And so the paint was not in good shape, and it was chipping, and you could actually see, this Ohio collars and everything, on the side. So I said, I would like you, I told my dad, you painted that sign. There it is sitting in our driveway. I'd like you to repaint it, and I want to put the sign up in our driveway. So we chipped the paint off and to get the true collars because it was faded in the front, and we went all over the place. I mean, we went to Chillicothe, Portsmouth, Ashland, Huntington to try to get an exact match of the pool colors. We finally actually did find something in Ashland. Where we found the matching collars, got that paint, and I had Dad paint that sign. I have some pictures of him painting that sign, and then we sunk it in concrete, put it in our driveway. So for me, it's a fond remembrance indeed, because every day when I come home, I come down our driveway, and the first thing that I spy is Dreamland pool sign, and I remember my father. But here's what it was one of the things that put me over the edge in actually doing this film was that story kind of got out, and then I began to notice that sometimes when I was out, and because our house sits back from the road, and it's a driveway down, and signs set back from the road, but you can see it from the road. And sometimes I'd be out in the yard working or outside, and I'd see a car come by, and I'd see it sort of go by slowly, and then maybe stop, maybe even back up, and I'd see people trying to take pictures. It was zoom lenses from the so I would run out. I'd see this, and I'd say, "Oh, you looking at the sign?" I say, "Yeah." I said, "Well, get out and come on down and get the close up." And this happened time and time again over a period of years. This is it. People would come out. I don't know, sometimes it was a special trip, sometimes, maybe they're just out for a Sunday afternoon drive or whatever. It happened multiple times that people wanted a picture of that sign. And that's what I also said to myself, wow, I mean, this is, there's something here. This pool means something to people beyond just a place to go swimming. And got me to thinking now seriously about, well, okay, what is it? What was it that spoke to people? So that is that's going to be a part of the film. And part of the sadness is the return to that spot as well. You can actually still see where we cut the it's still there. The bottom part of the pole that sign hung up there on Kendall Avenue. But Dreamland at least lives on in the sign. Yes.
Chris told me one time he thought the water in the pool came from a spring that was there. We know that there was a spring we could see.
Yes. And indeed, but not, I mean, you're talking about 1 million gallons. And so that spring was a continuously running spring. And in fact, I mean, you might remember, depends on which decade you were, As I mentioned, Jamie Williams every year kept adding something, putting money back into it. Some of that was buying more land, and some of that was actual improvements and upgraded maintenance and whatnot. And year after year after year, that just kept accumulating. And so there was something new almost every year at the pool. And so part of that was, well, I want to get specifically to your question. Say the question again.
I just was asking about the spring.
Yes, the spring. There was always a problem back from the time that pool was open, of especially after major rainstorms. But that was a consistent problem of that entire area where the tennis club is located. There was a spring there. That spring came right out of that hillside there, and it would flood, and there was, consistent. That area was never used in the past. Well, one of the upgrades to the pool is that my dad and Pat Mitchell, I put the work into that. I remember watching them do it over a period of time. Was they built, and with stonework, they actually capped that spring into, and there was a well. In fact, it's still there. I mean, the people at the tennis club, I had to go up there and tell them what that was. Nobody ever knew. If the sort of reception area there of the tennis club, there's a round stone structure that they've got wood or something over the top of it, and then just but that was a well. That was the spring. And then what they did was, and then they built from there. They put a line in from there of steel pipe. So I remember them digging up from there to the shallow end. You might remember where the basketball court was, and there's stairs that went down. And at the bottom of those stairs, there was water coming out all the time, 24 hours a day. In fact, many people would, and people talk about that, where it became the new Kinney Spring, because back in the old days, it's basically in 1937. That's a part of the story of the River Voices. The people were lined up for a block, bringing their jugs and filling up the water at Kinney Spring. And Kinney Spring ended up being all contaminated, and they couldn't use that anymore for drinking water. But people had kind of gotten into habits of wanting good, fresh, high river water. In those days was not nearly as good as it is now. So people wanted some like, clean water supply, and they had the water tested, and it was good water. So they put that in, and it started becoming a popular place that people would come to the pool to go swimming, but they'd bring jugs with them and fill them up before they went home. And some people would actually come down and they let them in, come with their jugs to, they didn't want to go swimming, they just wanted to get spring water, and they'd let people come in and go and fill their water, and leave for many years. Well, that solved the problem, but of the flooding out where the tennis club is. But that was a continuous flow. So what they did as well is they built kind of they could put an extension on that, and so all night long, right after when the pool closed, and they would extend it out, and it would refill whatever the water loss overnight, whatever the water loss was for the day. So that actually became an important part of the economics, even, because there was a lot of that much body of water and people splashing and all that. They lost a lot of water every day, but it was refilled from that spring for decades. So that was a kind of important part. Well, now you had that dry area out there. So what they ended up doing, again, took several years, was they built a picnic area, and then they covered it with what in those days we called alcinite, which is that fiberglass corrugated plastic. So it was and then that nice gray stonework, which is still there inside the tennis club. That became a covered picnic area, and that became extremely popular. There was an outdoor picnic area right by the, which had barbecue grills that was out by where the playground was, because there was a full playground really of playground equipment, swings, teeter-totters, all that. So there was an outdoor picnic area there, but that indoor picnic area, which you could rent, became very popular for private parties. I mean, there were graduation parties and coming out parties and this, and I mean, and a lot of businesses rented that space. Martings and Williams and all these companies would have their company picnics up at Dreamland Pool, usually in August. That space was in constant use. With one group after another, the hospital. Man, the hospital had have a huge shindig up there every summer. But that space was rented out. I mean, class reunions and just for every imaginable occasion. It became a very popular space because you could have your own private little party up there in a covered space. You didn't have to worry about weather. So that's how that all came into being. Well, then when it later became a tennis club, they built the tennis courts, and then there was the office, and there's some stairs down to what was the picnic area, and that well is still there. The cabinets with the stonework still there, but that dates back to those days. And that was one of the improvements for that year in the pool. Other things were covered, the patios. When I grew up, there wasn't any cover on the patios. But you might recall that there were picnic tables and covered again with that alcinite picnic areas up on the concrete patios. Well, actually, I remember the pool. I'm betraying my age, but I remember the pool when there weren't concrete patios. That was grass. Where the restaurant, you might recall where the restaurant was, back in the 1940s, that was grass just outside of the restaurant, and then it slopes down to where the walkway was, around the pool. So it was a sort of a terrace, kind of a grass terrace, which of course was a part of the reason for the name, Terrace Club. That kind of terrace on both sides of the central pavilion, but also the terraces that wrapped around the hill that went up. Thus the name Terrace Club. So the pool underwent a lot of changes over the years, thanks to these year by year sort of improvements, and it was maintained very well. And again, I lived that because of my father. It wasn't just a matter of going up there after school was out, because the opening day was always Memorial Day. The closing day was always Labor Day. And usually school started the day after Labor Day, and schools got out just about Memorial Day at the end of May. So that was the pool time. But that's not the only time that was put in at that pool, and I know because I worked with my father for many years. I made a little pocket money by going up and helping out. All these improvements that took place, and it wasn't matter just what you had to do to open the place and close the place. There were these improvements, and so they would work right up until freeze. So I mean, Pat and Mitchell and Dad would go up there after school and work, or on weekends and go up there and work, and there were so many other things. I mean, some of you might remember, he had a piano. This is again a donation to Jamie Williams. He had a piano in his home. They moved and they donated the piano. Nice piano, actually. Any of you remember that piano?
Upstairs.
Upstairs, yes. Yeah, so some of you do remember that. Well, and some of you might remember the actual, there were several people in town, including some of you might remember Charlie Sherman used to come up there and play that piano up on the second story of the pavilion. Yes.
You brought up the restaurant. What made the French fries so good?
That is the $64,000 question. Maybe you can answer that because it's amazing. The one thing that people keep bringing this up over and over is the smells. People talk about two smells at the pool: chlorine and the French fries. It's like people, yeah, that's what everybody says. Everybody has these wonderful memories of the French fries up at the pool. Whatever their magic recipe is, they rivaled KFC because
I sure would like to have it.
Yeah. You're right in there because we have heard that 100 times. People talk about the French fries and say they never found French fries like that. And they still remember that smell. The jukebox, that's another thing. I mean, here's another old tidbit which I think is fascinating. I mentioned the social media. There's one social media thread, which is how I kind of got onto this. But what's happened in more recent years is that other social media threads have started. There's actually 4 social media threads out there on Dreamland, 2 of which are exclusively Dreamland, nothing else. That's where we've gotten a lot of pictures. I mean, fortunately, that's been a real boon for us because there is a social media thread, which is, you're from Portsmouth, Dreamland Pool. Everything on there is just Dreamland. That started about maybe 4 years ago or so now. That's still very active. I mean, I keep getting things all the time from that, and we've actually, through that, discovered, and that's what's moved this project forward. Because we really ran into a brick wall as far as the finding more material is concerned. But it's that social media thread where I've gotten to hold the names of people that live in Montana and Texas and California and Florida and that are on that where I've made an appeal and then gotten their contact information. So we're getting stuff now that is coming from not just Portsmouth, they're coming from all over the country. People have this attachment to Portsmouth and Dreamland Pool. So that's one. There's another thread which is exclusively on the music that you grew up with at Dreamland Pool and the Friday night swim dances, where people post the songs that meant something to them in their time and Friday night swim dances. And so they'll sort of post that. And you look at that, and there must be 100 songs on there of people that have posted that, that's their sort of memory of Friday night swim dances at Dreamland. So it's and these threads are, again, they keep going. They're still there, still going on. So it's just a remarkable phenomenon. And as I said, I think that reflects something much more than just nostalgia.
They play WIY radio.
Oh, yeah. Well, now you could tell us this story because this is a story.
I tell everybody to turn so they don't burn.
Yeah, exactly.
I did the 10 to 2 shift, 72, 73, 74, 75, so they were listening to me. So then I get off work and
And this is a common story that we've heard of people in those, in those years, because they eventually put out.
One of them, yeah.
Ah.
It was in the 70s anyway. It started in the 60s.
Yeah, it started in the 60s, and the pool, because prior to that time.
That shift, make sure you tell people the turns. Somebody called one time, gave me a hard time because they didn't hear me tell
And they got burned. So here's this.
Yeah, there'd be pool dances with DJs. Gary Ray did them. Mostly they were DJs from WII radio because we were playing the top 40 music.
And there were a number of local bands over the years that played up there as well, like the Ivy Leaguers.
Band, whatever they called. He was the best guitarist ever.
Does anybody remember the Ivy Leaguers?
Sure.
Huh?
Flip Phillips was
Flip Phillips was a drummer, right?
some other guys that played there. That was before my time. But I just
Yeah, that would have been in the late 50s and early 60s.
I remember Gary Ray Mullins, who was one of our DJs in the late 60s, doing swim dances there because I helped carry his records and stuff. I'm with the band. I was like 12 or something.
Well, up until the 1960s, they didn't have a loudspeaker system. But they put in a loudspeaker system, and that's when that came into play. So what they began doing was putting on, music on these loudspeakers, and that's where this came in. Who invented that? Who actually made that up to begin with?
Couldn't tell you. My dad may have said that. I don't know. All I know is growing up there that we did. So.
Well, that's what people from the decade of the 60s and the 70s talk about is that, we'd be laying out and it'd come on the radio, time to burn, or turn so you don't burn.
We have to use spots to prove it.
All right.
We didn't know then what we know now.
Right.
Because I used to take baby oil, iodine,
Oh, yeah.
aluminum foil around my face so I would tan. I mean, we didn't know that the sun was.
Well, here's another story that I've heard from several different. We've interviewed several people who've told about this story who were the moms of swim team, the members, and the swim team used. Were you involved with that?
My son was a swimmer.
Really? Well, apparently they used to, because this was after my time. I had left town, and then we didn't have a swim team when I grew up. But they apparently used to practice in the morning just when the pool opened. And it would open at like 10 a.m. Well, what moms would do was they would give beach towels or towels to their kids that were on the swim team, so that they could, because they were there right when the pool opened, and they would run out to the to get the select positions and lay out the towels. And the moms would come out like for lunchtime or something in the afternoon, but they'd have their grounds staked out, so to speak. And the most valuable real estate, as has been described to me multiple times, was moms with young kids definitely wanted to be right by the 1 foot shallow end. So boy, that was the really valuable real estate, so to speak. So yeah, so the moms would be laying out there even on the concrete. Especially after they put up, because that's another thing that didn't exist for most of its existence. It was the awning over the shallow end there. But once that went up, then laying out on the concrete became a big thing, and because they could lay right there, and their kid was 10 feet away in the 1 foot section of the pool. Right. Yeah. So. It's a perfect position for young children. So, and it just goes on and on. There are just so many stories relating to one aspect or another of life at Dreamland, and it truly was a dreamland. So anyway, we're trying to capture this and that's where we are. And if anybody has any other questions, comments, thoughts?
I'm glad you decided to do this because of all your stories and growing up there and being with your father. You are the perfect person to do this.
Well, as I said, I didn't think so for many years, but came around to this, and now that I'm deeply into it, I think we're actually going to have a pretty powerful story here. That's so we're quite happy with this. I might mention as well. There's because I'm asked. This is the number one question my son is asked is, "What's it like to work with your old man?" And he's got this beautiful stock answer where he says, "It's a real bonding experience." And he kind of says it in that sarcastic tone of voice, right? And people crack up. And indeed, it is. It's been such a wonderful journey to do this film work. As I said, it came about quite accidentally, but what a wonderful journey! And one of the things that I've learned and sort of discovered in this is I really, truly, fully understand why partnerships fall apart, business partnerships or partnerships of any sort. It's when ego gets involved. And because people assume, for instance, that this is a senior-junior relationship. It's not. Sometimes I wonder if the milkman wasn't involved here because because my son and I approach things in such fundamentally different ways. We see things differently, and we have different approaches to things. And when it comes to the film work, it's we clash quite often, actually, over. But it ends up being like a dialectic in which you have sort of opposing points of view or opposing positions on something, but you work that out and you come up with a synthesis which is neither this nor that, but is better than each of you could have done alone. And that's why I never tire of these films. I mean, I've seen River Voices, I've seen Beyond These Walls, I mean, so many times. I've talked about it, I've showed it, it's just, but I never, every time I look at it, it's like, well, it's very much like going to the Floodwall murals. When you go to the Floodwall murals, you don't go once. And every time you go, you see something different or new or in a different way. It never gets boring. It never gets tiresome. It speaks to you in some way. And that's kind of what happens, in terms of our, film work. And so I'll look at something and I'll say, that's not bad. That's pretty good. But I know how we got there, and how this was really a synthesis. And so there's this creativity involved there, which is just so rewarding, and I think it comes out with a better product. And to be able to sort of take this journey with our son is a special privilege. So it's been quite a journey. So here I am.
Thanks for doing it. Thank you.
So, I hope to see you all at the premiere. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.